On Ideas, the 1988 Massey Lectures, about media, propaganda, and democracy. A series of 5 talks, one each night this week, divided into 16 sections, including questions from a panel of distinguished Canadian journalists. The Massey Lectures have been an annual event on CBC Radio for the past 27 years. The Massey Lectures are commissioned by the CBC to present original work by prominent intellectuals in the social sciences and the humanities, the physical sciences, and literature. The 1988 Massey Lectures are given by Noam Chomsky, Institute Professor in the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Boston. Professor Chomsky's work in structural linguistics is world-renowned, and he's also well known for his controversial books of political criticism, focusing especially on the place of the United States in international affairs. Last month, Pantheon published his latest book, written with co-author Edward Herman. It's called Manufacturing Consent. Professor Chomsky says that a primary function of the mass media, a system he suggests is more properly called the elite media, is to mobilize public support for the special interests that dominate the government and the private sector. This view is in contrast to the common assumption that the media act independently of power elites and are committed to discovering and reporting the truth. Professor Chomsky has demonstrated, by assembling a mass of data from the mainstream print and electronic press, that the common assumption is wrong, that the mass media in fact constitute a propaganda system devoted to conveying what Reinhold Niebuhr called necessary illusions about the world, devised by the intellectual elites. Without these necessary illusions, there's a danger that democracy will function altogether too well, that there will be, in the words of the Trilateral Commission, a crisis of democracy that will threaten elite power and privilege. One way to see how the mass media function to support the necessary illusions required by government and business elites is to compare style and content of news reports where the actions of official friends and official enemies are concerned. Professor Chomsky does that tonight, examining the treatment of Israel, an official friend of the United States, and Nicaragua, an official enemy, in the U.S. media, which is also our main source of information about international affairs. The 1988 Massey Lectures, Part 8. Noam Chomsky.
Fabrication of necessary illusions for social management is as old as history. But in the democratic system, the necessary illusions cannot be imposed by force. Rather, they must be instilled in the public mind by more subtle means. A totalitarian state can be satisfied with lesser degrees of allegiance to required truths. It is sufficient that people obey. What they think is a secondary concern. But in a democratic political order, there's always the danger that an independent thought might be translated into political action. So it is important to eliminate the threat at its root. Debate cannot be stilled, and indeed it should not be stilled in a properly functioning system of propaganda. The reason is that it has a system-reinforcing character if it is constrained within proper bounds. What is essential is to set the bounds firmly. Controversy may rage as long as it adheres to the presuppositions that define the elite consensus. And it should furthermore be encouraged within these bounds. That helps to establish these doctrines as the very condition of thinkable thought, and it reinforces the belief that freedom reigns. One crucial doctrine, standard throughout history, is that the state is adopting a defensive stance, resisting challenges to order and to its noble principles. Thus, the United States is invariably resisting aggression, sometimes what's called internal aggression. Accordingly, it's a logical impossibility that anyone should oppose U.S. aggression. That's a category that cannot exist. Westerners have no problem in perceiving the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan as brutal aggression, but the U.S. invasion of South Vietnam in the early 1960s cannot be perceived as such. True, U.S. forces were directly engaged in large-scale bombing and defoliation, in an effort to drive the population into concentration camps where they could be, as we put it, protected from the enemy whom it was conceded they willingly support. True, a huge U.S. expeditionary force invaded and ravaged the country and later its neighbors with the explicit aim of destroying what was clearly recognized to be the only mass-based political force and eliminating the danger of political settlement that was sought on all sides. But throughout, we were resisting aggression in our yearning for democracy. Throughout the war, there was no departure in the mainstream from the doctrine that the United States was defending South Vietnam. Unwisely, the doves came to believe. Years later, the doctrine remains beyond challenge, a most remarkable demonstration of the effectiveness of democratic systems of thought control. Similarly, in the case of Central America today, the United States is defending freedom in what are called the fledgling democracies and restoring democracy to Nicaragua. We find this view even at the extreme of expressible dissent in the elite media. In a bitter condemnation of the U.S. attack on Nicaragua, Atlantic Monthly editor Jack Beatty writes that democracy has been our goal in Nicaragua, and to reach it we have sponsored the killing of thousands of Nicaraguans. One could hardly find a more consistent critic of U.S. policy in the corporate media than columnist Tom Wicker of the New York Times. He condemns the application of the Reagan doctrine to Nicaragua because, in his words, the United States has no historic or God-given right to bring democracy to other nations. Critics assume without a second thought that a yearning for democracy has indeed guided U.S. policy towards Nicaragua since July 1979, when our client Somoza was overthrown, though admittedly we were not guided by this policy before the miraculously and curiously timed transformation took place. Central America has an evident interest in hounding the Sandinistas to honor their pledges to democratize, so the editors of the Washington Post admonish. There's no problem of ensuring democracy in the U.S.-backed terror states of Central America, firmly under military rule, behind a thin civilian facade. The same editorial in the Washington Post warns that from the incursions into Honduras in March 1988, it is plain what Nicaragua's threats to Honduras are. The reference is to military operations in northern Nicaragua, in which Nicaraguan forces, in hot pursuit of Contra invaders, penetrated a few kilometers into areas of Honduras that had long been ceded to the Contras. In the United States, these actions elicited renewed outrage over the threat of the Sandinistas to overrun their neighbors in the interests of their Soviet master. This heartfelt concern over the sanctity of borders is perhaps somewhat tainted by the curious conception of a border as a kind of a one-way mirror. So the sanctity of a border is not violated by U.S. supply flights to its proxy forces who have entered Nicaragua from their Honduran bases. But putting aside these matters, we can assess the seriousness of the concern by turning to the results of a controlled experiment that history obligingly constructed. Just as the free press was consumed with rage over this latest proof of the aggressiveness of the violent communist totalitarians in Central America, with major stories and angry commentary, our client State of Israel launched another series of its periodic operations in Lebanon. These operations were north of the sector of southern Lebanon that Israel has virtually annexed as a security zone, integrating the area with Israel's economy and compelling its 200,000 Lebanese inhabitants to provide soldiers for the South Lebanese Army, an Israeli mercenary force, as the Israeli press observes. The Israeli operations included bombing of Palestinian refugee camps and Lebanese towns and villages with large-scale destruction, dozens of people killed and many wounded, including many civilians. All of this was barely reported, and there was no noticeable reaction. The only rational conclusion is that the media outrage over the far less serious and more justified Nicaraguan incursion was entirely unprincipled, mere fraud. The absence of comment or even serious reporting of the Israeli actions in Lebanon is perhaps understandable. These operations were, after all, rather muted by Israeli standards. They do not compare with the murderous Iron Fist operations in Lebanon in 1985, or the bombing of villages in the Bekaa Valley a year earlier, with 100 killed and 400 wounded, mostly civilians, including 150 children in a bombed-out schoolhouse in one raid. These were reported, but without affecting the elevated status of Israel, this tiny nation symbol of human decency, as the editors of the New York Times described it, just at the height of the repression of the current Palestinian uprising, with beatings, killings, gassing, and collective punishment. It is a country that cares for human life, in the admiring words of the Washington Post editors in the wake of the Iron Fist atrocities. The fact that Israel maintains a security zone in southern Lebanon, controlled by a terrorist mercenary army backed by Israeli might, also passes without notice. And the same is true of Israel's regular practice of hijacking and piracy in international waters, and other actions that are rarely even reported. If Soviet Jews were to suffer the treatment meted out regularly to Arabs, or if some official enemy, such as Nicaragua, were to impose repressive measures approaching the Israeli standard, the outcry would be deafening. During Israel's March 1988 operations in Lebanon, there was no issue of hot pursuit. Israel is not an impoverished country attempting to survive the terrorist attack of a superpower and its lethal economic warfare. But Israel is a U.S. client, and therefore it inherits the right of aggression. Nicaragua, in contrast, is denied the right even to drive attacking forces out of its own territory. This is on the tacit assumption that no state has the right to defend itself from U.S. attack, another crucial doctrine that underlies responsible debate. It's remarkable to see how deeply this doctrine is entrenched. To cite one striking example, nothing arouses greater hysteria in the United States than reports that Nicaragua is planning to obtain MiG fighters. When such reports were floated by the Reaganites to eliminate the danger of honest reporting of the Nicaraguan elections in November 1984, even outspoken doves warned that the United States would have to bomb Nicaragua to destroy the invented MiGs. The reason is that they're also capable against the United States, a dire threat to our security, as Massachusetts Senator Paul Tsongas, a noted dove, put it at the time. In another propaganda coup of December 1987, a Sandinista defector was presented with elaborate accompanying fanfare in the media. He produced a series of revelations about Sandinista intentions, the most stunning of which was that Nicaragua was hoping to obtain jet planes to defend its territory from U.S. attack, plainly an intolerable outrage. It is, of course, well understood that Nicaragua had no other way to prevent the CIA from supplying the forces it directs within Nicaragua, or to interfere with the surveillance flights by U.S. aircraft that provide these forces with up-to-the-minute intelligence on Nicaraguan troop deployments so that they can safely attack soft targets in accordance with Pentagon and State Department directives. The logic is clear. Nicaragua has no right of self-defense. It is intolerable, tantamount to aggression, for Nicaragua to interfere with U.S. violence and terror by attempting to defend its airspace or by attacking the U.S. proxy forces. For the same reason, the report by the same defector that Nicaragua intended to reduce its military forces while providing light arms to the population for defense against possible U.S. invasion elicited further outrage as it was transmuted by the free press into a threat to conquer the hemisphere. One might ask why Nicaragua is so intent on obtaining Soviet planes. Why not French Mirage jets instead? In fact, the Sandinistas would be quite happy to obtain jet interceptors from France, and quite openly say so. They cannot, because U.S. pressure has blocked supply from any non-communist source. All of this is unreportable because it would give the game away. A corollary to the principle that official enemies do not have the right of self-defense is that if Nicaragua attacks Contra forces within its own territory, the United States plainly has the right to provide military aid to its proxies. The Byrd Amendment on Assistance for the Nicaraguan Resistance, voted by the Senate in August 1988, with the effusive support of leading doves, permits military aid to the proxy forces within Nicaragua in the event of an unprovoked attack against the Contras or a continued unacceptable level of military assistance by Soviet bloc countries, all other sources having been barred and Washington, of course, being the judge of what is acceptable. The August 5th Senate debate on the Byrd Amendment gains heightened significance from its timing. 3 days earlier, the Contras had attacked the crowded passenger vessel Mission of Peace after allowing an Army patrol boat to pass by. They had killed 2 people and wounded 27, all civilians, including a Baptist minister from New Jersey, a member of a U.S. religious delegation. The Senate doves, who bitterly condemned the Sandinistas, made no mention of this event. Perhaps they had missed the tiny notice it received the day before in the New York Times, tacked on to a column reporting their deliberations. There was no subsequent commentary. The logic is again clear. If the Sandinistas seek to root out the U.S.-run terrorists who carried out this atrocity, that proves that they are communist totalitarians, and we are entitled to send military as well as so-called humanitarian aid to the resistance so that they can pursue their tasks more effectively. The general outlines of U.S. policy are presented in a lucid manner by a Carter administration Latin American specialist, Robert Pastor, who is actually at the dovish extreme of the political and ideological spectrum. He explains that the United States, I'm quoting, that the United States did not want to control Nicaragua or other nations in the region, but it also did not want to allow developments to get out of control. It wanted Nicaraguans to act independently, except when doing so would affect U.S. interests adversely. In short, Nicaragua should be free to do what we determine to be right and proper, and Nicaragua should achieve self-determination in the manner that the United States defines as appropriate.
On Ideas, you're listening to the 1988 Massey Lectures by Noam Chomsky. Part 9. The Bounds of the Expressible.
In the first lecture, I mentioned some of the ways of approaching the study of the media and evaluating models of media performance. One appropriate method is to consider the spectrum of opinion that is allowed expression. According to the propaganda model, one would expect the spectrum to be bounded by the elite consensus while encouraging tactical debate within it. Consider U.S. policy with regard to Nicaragua. That's probably elicited more controversy and impassioned rhetoric than any other single topic during the past several years. There is debate between the hawks on the one side and the doves on the other. The position of the hawks is expressed by a declaration of the State and Defense Departments on International Human Rights Day in December 1986. They asserted that in the American continent there is no regime more barbaric and bloody, no regime that violates human rights in a manner more constant and permanent than the Sandinista regime. Similar sentiments are widely voiced in the media and the political system, and it follows that we should support the democratic resistance to communist terror. At the other extreme, the doves generally agree that we should dismiss the World Court, the United Nations, and other hostile forums, as they're called, that pander to communists and pathological Third World anti-Americanism. The doves offer their support for the noble objective of the Reagan administration to somehow democratize Nicaragua, but they feel that the Contras are not the instrument that will achieve that objective. I've been quoting Representative Michael Barnes, who was one of the most outspoken critics of the Contra option. A leading Senate dove, Alan Cranston, recognizes that the Contra effort is woefully inadequate to achieve democracy in Nicaragua, in his words, so we should find other means to isolate the reprehensible government in Managua and leave it to fester in its own juices. Media doves observe that Mr. Reagan's policy of supporting the Contras is a clear failure, so we should acquiesce in some negotiated regional settlement that would be enforced by Nicaragua's neighbors. That's Tom Wicker of the New York Times. Expressing the same thought, the editors of the Washington Post see the Contras as an imperfect instrument, so we must find other means to fit Nicaragua back into a Central American mode and impose reasonable conduct by a regional standard. Other doves feel that we should not too quickly reject the State Department argument that agricultural cooperatives are legitimate targets for Contra attacks. The reason, I'm quoting, is that in a Marxist society geared for war, there are no clear lines separating officials, soldiers, and civilians. What is required is careful cost-benefit analysis, a determination of the amount of blood and misery that will be poured in, and the likelihood that democracy will emerge at the other end. Those are the words of New Republic editor Michael Kimsley. Neither he nor the State Department explain why similar arguments do not justify attacks by Abu Nidal on Israeli kibbutzim, which are far better defended against an incomparably lesser threat. Notice that regional arrangements need not be imposed on our Salvadoran and Guatemalan friends, who have slaughtered perhaps 150,000 people during this period, or on our clients in Honduras, who kill fewer outright, but have left hundreds of thousands to starve to death while the country exports food for the profit of agribusiness. Their countries already conform to the Central American mode of repression, exploitation, and rule by privileged elements that accede to the demands of U.S. power, what we call democracy, so even hideous atrocities are of no account, and they merit aid and support, with occasional expressions of regret if the terror, torture, and mutilation become too visible to ignore. By 1986, the Contra option was opposed by 80% of American leaders, polls report. The propaganda model would therefore predict debate over Contra aid, but near unanimity in opposition to the Sandinistas. To test the hypothesis, consider the period of maximum intensity of debate over Nicaragua policy, the first 3 months of 1986, when attention was focused on the issue of Contra aid. During these months, the New York Times and the Washington Post, the two major national newspapers, they ran no less than 85 opinion columns on the matter. That includes their regular columnists. As expected, they were divided over Contra aid. But of the 85 columns, all 85 were critical of the Sandinistas, the vast majority harshly so. Thus, 100% conformity was achieved on the major issue. It's not that more sympathetic voices are lacking in the mainstream. There are many who would easily qualify for admission to the debate if they had the right things to say. This includes Latin American scholars whose opinion pieces are regularly rejected by the press, or the charitable development agency Oxfam, with long experience in the region, which found Nicaragua's record to be exceptional among the 76 developing countries in which it works in the commitment of the political leadership to improving the condition of the people and encouraging their active participation in the development process. I'm quoting here an Oxfam report. Or consider the founder of Costa Rican democracy, Jose Figueres. Just at the time we're speaking of, early 1986, he had described himself in an interview as pro-Sandinista and quite friendly toward the Sandinistas. He was an observer in the 1984 elections, and he said that the 2-to-1 margin in favor of the Sandinistas in these elections certainly seemed to reflect what you find in the streets. Figueres condemned what he called Washington's incredible policies of persecuting the Sandinistas, and Washington's efforts to undo Costa Rica's social institutions and to turn the whole economy over to the local oligarchy or to U.S. or European companies. Of course, as a dedicated supporter of the United States, he found these efforts, in his words, no doubt well-intentioned. The United States, he said, is turning most Central Americans into mercenaries for its attack against Nicaragua. I've been familiar with Nicaragua all my life, he said, and never before have I seen, as I do now, a Nicaraguan government that cares for its people. In another interview at the same time, he reiterated that for the first time, Nicaragua has a government that cares for its people, his words. Commenting on a recent visit, he said that he found a surprising amount of support for the government in what he called an invaded country, adding that the United States should allow the Sandinistas to finish what they started in peace. They deserve it. Such comments as these lack ideological serviceability. The same is true of Figueres' statement that he understands why La Prensa was closed, having censored the press himself when Costa Rica was under attack by Somoza in the 1950s. Hence, Central America's leading democratic figure must be censored out of the media, as he is, though his name can still be invoked for the anti-Sandinista crusade. Thus, New York Times Central America correspondent James Lemoyne, in one of his anti-Sandinista diatribes, refers to Figueres as the man who is widely considered the father of Costa Rican democracy. But he does not tell us, nor would he or his colleagues ever tell us, what Figueres has to say about the Sandinistas. The front pages of the New York Times present a picture of Nicaragua as seen through the eyes of their reporter James Lemoyne as he briefly passed through. A brutal and repressive state under one-party rule, with crowds of pot-bellied urchins in the streets, state security agents ubiquitous, the army everywhere, growing support for the peasant army resisting Sandinista oppression, and the population reduced to bitterness and apathy. That's his description, though somehow they are resisting a foreign attack under which any other state in the region and most elsewhere would have quickly crumbled. The New York Times does not present the picture that was seen by the CIA-appointed press spokesman for the Contras, Edgar Chamorro, on a 3-week visit at the same time. Speaking to dozens of people in the streets after a Sandinista rally, he found them, in his words, very aware, very politically educated, very committed. They thought for themselves. They were there because they wanted to be there. The days are gone when a dictator can get up and harangue people. What I have seen here, he said, is very, very positive. People are walking on their own 2 feet, regaining the dignity and nationalism that they had lost under Somoza. He saw very little militarization and a deep sense of equality, what he called one of the accomplishments of the revolution. I didn't see people hungry, he said. Most people look very healthy, strong, and alive. And he saw few beggars, unlike Honduras, or even in the city streets of the United States, he added. The opposition he described as the old oligarchy reliant on the United States. The war has led to a sense of nationalism and patriotism on the part of the youth who are drafted. The Sandinistas continue to be a people's party with commitment and goals that inspire so many people. They are Nicaraguan nationalists, revolutionaries, who want a more egalitarian model to improve the lives of the majority. The elections were good, the government is legitimate, and we should try to change from inside. I've just been quoting Chamorro's actual words from an interview that appeared in a tiny and obscure journal, and Chamorro himself points out that after he left the Contras, he found media access difficult, although when he was the spokesman, it was quite simple. The general reading public does not receive a range of perceptions such as these, but only one, the one that accords with the needs of American power. A year after these visits by Lemoyne and Chamorro, severe malnutrition began to appear in Managua and parts of the countryside, as U.S. terror and economic warfare continued to take their bitter toll in a pathetically poor country that is utterly dependent on economic relations with the United States for obvious historical and geopolitical reasons. George Shultz, Elliott Abrams, and their cohorts may not have overthrown the government, but they can take pride in having vanquished the programs of development, preventive medical care, and welfare. They can take pride in a notable increase in dying infants, epidemics, and other normal features of the Central American mode to which Nicaragua is to be restored by U.S. benevolence. The propaganda system may cover their tracks today, but history will render a different judgment. Let's return now to the 85 columns in the Washington Post and the New York Times at the peak period of Contra-debate. Still more interesting than the uniform hostility to the Sandinistas was the choice of topics. There are 2 very striking differences between the Sandinistas and the U.S. favorites who adhere to regional standards. The first of these is that the Sandinistas, whatever their sins, had not conducted campaigns of mass slaughter, torture, mutilation, and general terror to traumatize the population. In the 85 columns, there is not one phrase referring to this matter. The second major difference between the Sandinistas and the U.S. clients is that the Sandinistas had diverted resources to the poor majority and had attempted measures of meaningful social reform. In fact, they had done so quite successfully until U.S. economic and military warfare succeeded in reversing the unwelcome improvement in health and welfare standards, literacy, and development. These facts merit 2 passing phrases in 85 columns, one in a bitter condemnation of what's called the generally appalling leadership in this repressive society. In the 85 columns, there is no mention at all of Sandinista efforts to maintain a neutralist posture. For example, there is no mention of the fact that at the time of the U.S. embargo that has virtually wiped out private business and reduced the economy to bare survival, Nicaraguan trade with the Soviet bloc was about 20% of total trade. That's well below the figure for Europe and most of the Third World. That fact is inconsistent with... Let's turn now to another sample of opinion in the media a year later. In the first 6 months of 1987, the same two journals, the New York Times and the Washington Post, ran 61 columns and editorials relevant to U.S. policy in Nicaragua. Of these, 13 said nothing about the Sandinistas. Of the 48 that expressed an opinion, 46 were anti-Sandinista, again, most of them bitterly so. Of the two columns that expressed some sympathy for the Sandinistas, one was by Nicaraguan Ambassador Carlos Tunnerman. The other was by Dr. Kevin Cahill. He is the director of the Tropical Disease Center at Lenox Hill Hospital in New York, the only non-Nicaraguan commentator in the sample who could draw upon personal experience in Nicaragua and elsewhere in the Third World. His column was also the only one that took note of the successful Nicaraguan health and literacy measures and what he called the struggle against oppression and corruption waged under conditions of extreme adversity imposed by U.S. terror and economic warfare. Cahill's is also one of the two contributions among 61 that mention the World Court decision and international law. Once again, in these 61 columns, there is not a single phrase referring to the fact that unlike the U.S. clients in the so-called fledgling democracies, the Sandinistas had not launched a campaign of terror and slaughter to traumatize their populations. The totalitarian Sandinistas are contrasted with the struggling democracies of Central America, the imperfect but working democracy of Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador, which, although under communist guerrilla siege, is an imperfect democracy, but a democracy with an elected government. Notice that it is unlike Nicaragua, where there were no elections, so Washington has decreed. Well after the 1984 elections that established democracy in El Salvador to the applause of the free press, the human rights organization Socorro Juridico, which operates under the protection of the Archdiocese of San Salvador, observed that the continuing terror is still conducted by the same members of the armed forces who enjoy official approval and are adequately trained to carry out these acts of collective suffering. Salvadoran society, affected by terror and panic, a result of the persistent violation of basic human rights, shows the following traits, they said: collective intimidation and generalized fear on the one hand, and on the other, the internalized acceptance of the terror because of the daily and frequent use of violent means. In general, society accepts the frequent appearance of tortured bodies because basic rights, including the right to life, have absolutely no overriding value for society. These comments also apply to the supervisors of these operations in Washington. The fact was underscored by George Shultz in one of his lamentations on terrorism, a talk that he delivered at the very moment of the U.S. bombing of Libya. In El Salvador, he declared, "The results are something all Americans can be proud of. At least, all Americans who enjoy the sight of tortured bodies, starving children, terror and panic, and generalized fear." And James Lemoyne of the New York Times concludes that American support for elected governments in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras has been a relative success, which is no doubt true by some standards. The problem throughout, according to the media, is to find some way to compel Nicaragua to rein in its revolutionary army, as Democratic Senator Terry Sanford demands, an army that is illegitimately rampaging inside Nicaragua when it seeks to defend the country from U.S. attack. Apart from regular unsupported allegations of Sandinista aid to the Salvadoran guerrillas, the proclaimed basis for the fears of Sandinista aggression is another coup of the State Department propaganda services in what they called their Operation Truth. This is based upon a speech in which Comandante Tomas Borge expressed his hopes that Nicaragua would be an example that others would follow. He explained that Nicaragua cannot export our revolution, but can only export our example, while the people themselves of these countries must make their own revolutions. In this sense, he said, the Nicaraguan revolution transcends national boundaries. In a conscious and purposeful fraud, State Department psychological warfare operations converted these words into the threat of military conquest in pursuit of a revolution without borders. That phrase was used as the title of the pathetic September 1985 State Department white paper on alleged Nicaraguan aggression, and it's constantly been used since, often accompanied by the claim that this is a Sandinista Mein Kampf, as George Shultz warned Congress. The same fabrication served as the climax for Reagan's successful effort to obtain $100 million from Congress for the proxy army, just as the World Court called upon the United States to terminate its aggression. And the phrase remains a media staple in news columns and commentary. The hoax was publicly exposed at once, but this did not deter media agitprop in service of the worthy project of demonizing the Sandinista government and turning it into a real enemy and threat in the minds of the American people, as a Reagan administration official phrased the goal. Nor are these exercises deterred by the evident absurdity of the idea that Nicaragua could pose a threat of aggression, while the United States stands by in helpless impotence. Again, this is a most impressive demonstration of what can be achieved by a mobilized independent press. There was, to be sure, a basis for the perception that Nicaragua poses a threat. As Oxfam observed, Nicaragua posed the threat of a good example. Like Arevalo and Arbenz in Guatemala, Allende in Chile, and many others, Nicaragua was perceived as a rotten apple that might infect the barrel, a virus that might infect others, a cancer that might spread. This is the terminology that is constantly used by planners when they contemplate the dread prospect of independent development geared to domestic needs. The real fear was expressed by Secretary of State Shultz in March 1986. He warned that if the Sandinistas succeed in consolidating their power, then all the countries in Latin America who all face serious internal economic problems will see radical forces emboldened to exploit these problems. His words. It is therefore necessary to destroy the virus and inoculate the surrounding regions by terror. That's a persistent feature of U.S. foreign policy, but these truths too lie far beyond expression in the media. The range of opinion that is permitted expression and the way the news is filtered and adjusted ensures that public opinion will not stray from proper bounds, at least among the elite groups that count.
The 1988 Massey Lectures continue tomorrow night on Ideas, presented by Noam Chomsky. Several weeks ago, Professor Chomsky presented some of the material in these lectures to an audience at Ryerson Polytechnical Institute in Toronto, after which he was questioned by a panel of Canadian journalists. You'll hear parts of that panel discussion each night this week. This is David Frum, Associate Editor of Saturday Night Magazine.
Professor Chomsky, you argue for a model of the media in which the media argue for and defend the established institutions of society, and any deviation from that defense is dismissed or even suppressed, so that views that dissent from the overwhelming consensus that characterizes our society cannot get a hearing. Now, here you are tonight in a large lecture hall at Canada's most prestigious journalism school, speaking to an audience of journalists who are hearing your remarks with apparent approbation. Your remarks are being broadcast on the government-owned radio network as part of the most prestigious lecture series on that network. How'd that happen?
Recall that what I said was that this is a very good first approximation to the description of a complex social institution. Now, you remember that I mentioned, I'm afraid this remark may sound a little insulting, but let me try to say it without sounding that way. I specifically mentioned that in the United States, for example, if I wasn't talking about, say, listener-supported radio in a small community. In fact, as you get away from the elite centers that matter, things open up. Okay. Now, the fact of the matter is that Canada is a much more open society in this respect than the United States, and the reason is it's less important. This generalizes. I can talk this way in Belgium, in Israel, in Latin America. I can't talk, I can talk this way in the United States, but not on national radio and television because it's just too important. What people think about international affairs in Canada just doesn't matter that much to established power. If it did matter that much, Canada would close up too.
If CBC then is just a small publicly funded station in some small town, looked upon in that perspective, why don't we turn to the CBC person on stage here, and Margaret Daly, perhaps you can have a turn.
Well, I was intrigued by the thesis and particularly impressed by the volume of sort of factual documentation, and I look forward to reading this stuff in a long version. I guess the question that I want to ask, though, is given that this information is in discussion, you lay it all out, supposing people knew it, and obviously individuals do know it, minorities, intellectuals, foreign affairs buffs, if you want to call them that, those kinds of people can assemble all this information, then what? It doesn't seem to make any difference, and why is that?
Well, I think it does make a difference. I think it makes a lot of difference. I mentioned, not entirely jocularly, that if a third world country today were to put forth the American Constitution, we'd call it a reversion to Nazism, and I mentioned that that's a sign of hope and progress. There has been moral progress over 200 years. There's also been progress over 20 years, 30 years, in my active lifetime. Again, I'm talking mostly about the United States, but it's a different country than it was 20 or 30 years ago. Now, elites are not different. They're pretty much as indoctrinated as they always were. Elite group, contrary to a lot of necessary illusion, elite groups, including liberal intellectual elites, did not oppose the Vietnam War. They supported the Vietnam War, supported it enthusiastically. They began to turn against it somewhat after Wall Street turned against it, and more or less for the same reasons, because it was too costly. The media were almost totally closed to critics of the war. But among the general population, this crisis of democracy did take place, and it changed the society. I think it led to probably, I hope, a permanent cultural change outside the elite centers. And the United States is just a different country than it was 20 years ago in a lot of respects. Everything from interpersonal relations to treatment of ethnic minorities to concern over international affairs and so on. You can see, and then the reason is because outside of while the major institutions of indoctrination continue on their natural course, other modes of interaction did develop, and they remained, they're informal, they're inefficient. I spend probably 80%, I don't know, some huge percent of my time traveling around the country giving talks. Well, that's less efficient than writing for a major journal, but people do this, and ultimately it makes a difference. There are solidarity groups, there are all kind of organizations and so on, and they do make a difference. You can see it. So take, for example, I mentioned the U.S. attack against South Vietnam in the early 1960s. You compare the early 1960s with the 1980s. That's 20 years. When Ronald Reagan came into office, his administration, in my view, intended to emulate John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, except their target was Central America. They came out with a white paper in February 1981, right after they came into office, virtually a declaration of war. The communists are taking over the world. We've got to go in there and stop them. It was a precursor to direct U.S. military intervention in Central America. Now, what happened? And the media, incidentally, bought the whole story. There was virtually no criticism of the white paper when it came out, just enthusiastic support for it. However, the general population didn't, because the population is not what it was in the early 60s. When John F. Kennedy started sending the American Air Force to bomb South Vietnam on a regular basis, there was no protest. You couldn't get two people together in a living room to talk about it. And it didn't have to be hidden either. It was on the front page of the newspapers. Nobody cared. We want to bomb another country? Great. Let's go to the next thing. When Ronald Reagan's administration sort of indicated that they might try to turn to direct military intervention, there was a convulsion in the country. People started coming out of the woodworks. It ranged from a massive flow of letters to Washington, to demonstrations, to church groups getting involved. A whole array of protests began to develop spontaneously without any organization and structure. The reason is the country is just a lot different. Well, what happened? What happened is that the Reagan administration backed off. They, in fact, told the media to cool the rhetoric, to cut back the inflammatory rhetoric. They were afraid that much more central themes of their program would be endangered. After all, remember that they were trying to ram through a program that the population was strongly opposed to, a domestic economic program. They were trying to ram through destruction of the limited welfare measures that exist in the United States, a huge transfer of resources from the poor to the rich, a massive increase in state power, and huge public subsidy to high technology industry through the Pentagon system and so on. All of these things are contrary to what the public wanted, and they didn't want any protest about them. So what they did was back off from their inflammatory proclamations about Central America, and they went underground. That's what the Iran-Contra hearings were about. The administration was driven underground. The domestic population would not tolerate the activities that they wanted to carry out, and they therefore had to turn to illegal clandestine activities. Now, the Reagan administration was notorious for the level of its clandestine activities, and clandestine activities are a pretty good measure of popular dissidence. If there isn't any popular dissidence, you don't have to carry out clandestine activities. You can carry out overt international terrorism and violence, which is much more efficient. Overt violence is much more efficient than clandestine violence for obvious reasons. I mean, for one thing, it's just more efficient to do. For another thing, there isn't any risk that it will be exposed, which will cause, a scandal and so on and so forth. And in fact, the state was driven underground by popular dissidents. Well, that's important. Those are, I think that's one of the many reflections of the difference between the 1960s and the 1980s. I think and in fact, even the media are different. Bad as they are, I mean, as you can see, I'm no great enthusiast for the elite media, but they're better than they were 20 years ago. I mean, they're not as closed and restricted and constrained as they were 20 years ago, and that includes the elite media. So there are slow changes, and I think there is a slow move towards general democratization, much too slow, but not insignificant. And those are things that, first of all, one can be somewhat hopeful about, but it also teaches you a lesson. It means there are things you can do. After all, these are societies. Our societies, like Canada and the United States, have one tremendous virtue. The state is very restrictive in its capacity to use force against citizens. By comparative, it's not zero, but by comparative standards, it's low. And that means there's a great range of options available. People want to make use of them, and many do, and it makes a difference.
Noam Chomsky. This has been the third program in a series of 5 this week, presenting the 1988 CBC Massey Lectures on Media, Propaganda, and Democracy. We continue tomorrow. Noam Chomsky is Institute Professor in the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His latest book, written with co-author Edward Herman, is called Manufacturing Consent. It's published by Pantheon, and it's in bookstores and libraries now.